Hi, and welcome to Produce Talks, the CPMA podcast. I am your host and CPMA Education Manager, Jason Gorley. Before we get started, I just want to remind you to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the favorite podcast catcher of your choice. It'll help other people find the show and get more people listening. And before we get going, I also want to tell you about a webinar we have coming up for CPMA members on blockchains and how they will affect the future of the produce industry. This will be offered on February 15th, 2018. So if you haven't already, head to cpma.ca, look for the webinars, and sign up. We hope to see you there. And before we get started with this month's podcast, here's Selena to tell us all about this month's Fresh Health Award winner.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me here again. I'm really excited to announce our first winner of the Fresh Health Monthly Award for 2018. We want to congratulate Execulytics Consulting for winning the January Fresh Health Award. Their dedication to promoting Half Your Plate is just amazing. They've displayed the Half Your Plate logo on their website, and they're gearing up to be very active on social media as an industry partner. They're providing a great example of the simple ways that you can start to incorporate Half Your Plate in your marketing efforts. Congratulations, Mike and team.
Thanks, Selena. All right. This month on Produce Talks, we're connecting with Troy Sherman, who is our manager of policy here at CPMA. He is back from the 6th round of NAFTA negotiations in Montreal to tell us all about what it's like to be there on behalf of the produce industry, what issues they're looking for, and what it's like to be at the negotiations. So we're getting an inside look at the role CPMA is playing at these negotiations and how we're working for our members to make sure that they know what the best deal for our industry is. Here we go. Troy, at the highest level, these meetings are to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the industry on both sides of the Canadian and American border, even the Mexican, has benefited from the agreement that's been in place since 1994.
Overall, the NAFTA agreement has substantially enhance our ability to trade with one another by removing tariffs on goods and also trying to create integrated supply chains across the continent. So we're seeing a lot more companies have operations in all three countries, and that's largely benefit of NAFTA. So overall, trade has increased exponentially for all three countries as a trading bloc. It's one of the largest in the world. And so we want to make sure that as part of these negotiations that we're able to preserve that. But I think, for any agreement that's almost 24 years old, there's also room to modernize and to make sure that's keeping up with current changes in technology and regulations and also consumer demands. So this is both an opportunity, but it has been proving to be also a substantial challenge.
If we looked at trade prior to 1994 and trade now, fair to compare the markets at all? Like who the customers are? Because I know that there's a substantial number of states where their number one trading partner is Canada. Mm-hmm. Canada, there's a lot of trade that is now going across the border. You're saying that this is specifically because the agreement was in place, or was that already there?
There was a certain level of that there with the original Canada-U.S. free trade agreement that preceded NAFTA. This has really enhanced it and made it more of a regional agreement in terms of North America. And it goes even further than that, just looking at things like labor, and so how to increase labor standards in Mexico, and a number of other different things like Chapter 19 in terms of dispute settlement. That was unique to NAFTA. And so there are substantive changes in NAFTA. And because of this and because of the common rules of trade across all three countries, it has only increased our ability to do trade, and especially for products within fresh produce, where there's a seasonality component to what we're able to grow here in Canada, that's obviously benefited us and Canadian consumers as a whole.
So is there a big difference between this particular free trade agreement and other free trade agreements that exist? So like the one with the European Union or the one that's currently being negotiated with the Pacific Partnership?
Biggest difference is that this is the only one where our single largest trading partner is a part of. Because of President Trump's decision to withdraw from what's now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, our only trade agreement with the U.S. is through NAFTA. So I think that's one of the biggest differences. And also for our industry, it's also a lot easier to move product across a border via truck or train, or the ease of access to those two markets, which are huge markets, especially in the United States. That's one of the biggest differences between this agreement and others.
So right now, we're still operating under the current NAFTA agreement, right? So if these negotiations go nowhere, what happens?
Well, there's a couple of options you can go down. One, they decide to suspend the negotiations until after the Mexican presidential election to see who wins there. The presidential election, the president wouldn't take office until December of 2018. But then you also have midterms in the U.S. in November. So that's one challenge, and that would likely happen sometime in March if there were to be suspension of the negotiations. Another option is that the president decides to withdraw from NAFTA, and he can trigger that through an article within the agreement, and that launches a 6-month process of withdrawal. There is some debate in Washington around whether the president's able to do that unilaterally, or if it also had to rely on Congress to play a role on that front. This has never really been tested before, and although the U.S. Constitution gives power of international relations to the president, it gives the power of trade to Congress, which is why they ratify trade agreements. So it's unsure whether the president would be able to do that unilaterally. All we know is that lots of lawyers are going to be involved, lots of lawsuits, going to the courts and potentially in the Supreme Court to get a ruling on who has the final authority over that. Even if the president does decide to withdraw from that, there are still the NAFTA laws on the books in the U.S. that was passed by an act of Congress. So presumably they would have to pass an act to remove those laws. So there's a lot of speculation right now. No one knows what the outcome of that would be if the president decides to withdraw.
So it's not really cut and dry. It's not like he signs a piece of paper, 6 months later it's done. There's going to be a lot of hoops to jump through.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's one of the things that makes industry and business wary, is that level of uncertainty of what happens if he does trigger that article. And then there's obviously the option where we're able to sign an agreement. The president's able to see some wins based off of what he's been advocating for, both during his campaign and since his inauguration. So we're hopeful that we're going to be able to reach an agreement, but there's still a lot of major issues that need to be addressed, particularly on some of the more unconventional requests coming out of the U.S.
So you're just back from the 6th round of negotiations, right? Yeah. That took place in Montreal. So we've, as an association, been present at all of the, or just most of them? So
we've attended every round since round 3. Okay. We have been on the ground meeting with our U.S. counterparts and Mexican industry, meeting with our negotiators, making sure that we get the briefings, but that we're also being able to feed into some of the strategy that our negotiators are using at the table. So we've been very engaged with this, not only during the rounds themselves, but also in between the rounds, meeting with Minister Freeland's office and others to make sure that they're aware of some of the issues that we see coming up as part of the NAFTA negotiations.
So walk me through the day when you're there. Is everybody kind of just hanging out in a hotel waiting to be consulted?
There's a lot of lingering in hotel lobbies at NAFTA rounds. It really depends. We've been trying to be as proactive as possible to try and get meetings with negotiators and other industry groups in the U.S. and Mexico. So we've been quite busy. And it's also an opportunity for all the ag groups to kind of chat about other issues that are going on in Ottawa as well. Because everybody is there because it's going to impact their industry one way or another. So we've been trying to leverage those meetings for other discussions around political issues happening closer to home here in Ottawa. So we've been quite busy, but a lot of it is waiting around, waiting for a briefing or waiting for a negotiator to get in contact with you saying, hey, this was kind of brought up. What are your thoughts? Where do you think we should go on this?
And now it's time to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, Nature Fresh Farms.
Hi everyone, it's Ray here from Nature Fresh Farms. At Nature Fresh Farms, we know that developing healthy eating habits can be challenging, but it's not impossible. We believe that one of the best ways to stick to healthy eating is to meal prep. By preparing a week's worth of vegetables on Sunday, you will be set for the week ahead with conveniently cut snacks and meal options that are ready to go when you are. For more healthy eating tips, visit us at naturefresh.ca/eatmorevegetables or half your plate.
Thanks, Ray. And now, back to the conversation. Okay, so we've been there since the third round. So how did CPMA get a spot? Like, well, I guess not at the table, beside the table.
So we've been very involved with this since even before the president decided to notify Congress and the Canadians and Mexicans that he wanted to renegotiate NAFTA. So we've been meeting with the chief agricultural negotiator, we're meeting with the NAFTA chief negotiator, we're meeting with Minister Freeland's office, as well as Minister McCauley's office. So we've been very proactive about this ever since the inauguration. And because of that level of proactiveness, we've been very involved in these discussions and the stakeholder engagement sessions that the government's been putting on.
So we're not the only industry group that's there. How important is it for the industry groups that are there representing parts of the produce industry to kind of communicate and work together on common messaging, even across borders?
We've worked very hard to make sure that where possible our industry is able to come together. We've tried to host industry dinners at the different rounds, hosted by the host country organizations. And that's been hugely successful to have sometimes some very frank conversations about some of the issues being proposed as part of NAFTA. And we've been trying to keep the communication and open dialogue with our partners in the U.S. and Mexico. So even leading up to the round, we're in constant communication with them on a daily basis, then on a weekly basis, to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page, or if there are any grievances that they would like to see brought up during NAFTA, that we can discuss those as an industry as well, not just through our negotiators. So I think that's been hugely positive. And I think that as an industry, we have learned a lot more about each other than I think we knew beforehand, which I think can only be positive moving forward and leveraging those relationships in the future.
So there were some noted, well, I guess, I don't know if they were explicitly stated, but some identified potential big targets for the U.S. coming into these negotiations. So like our supply management system, our intellectual property laws, softwood lumber. I guess produce wasn't really identified as one of those contentious issues. So are there big concerns around the produce industry going into these negotiations? Are we a target somewhat?
I hate to use the word target, but there is a proposal being put forward by the U.S. that's looking to introduce a seasonality provision as part of its trade remedy, as part of the trade remedy chapter of NAFTA. Essentially look at ways to put in place seasonal anti-dumping and countervailing duties on perishable items. And it would reduce the data requirements in order to prove injury, and reduce the amount of organizations that need to be on board to ask for a duty to be implemented by the U.S. government. So this would have a huge impact on the fresh produce industry, looking at different commodities that are going across the borders and that can be in competition with one another. And so we want to make sure that, the CPMA's stance is that, we're not supportive of this. We believe that a current trade remedy laws benefit everybody and that it has worked in the past. And we want to make sure that any decision that's made in order to prove injury around countervailing and anti-dumping duties, there is a significant body of data to prove that that is the case. This would have dramatic impact on growers and shippers and, at the end of the day, consumers. If we start seeing those extra duties added on to goods that we buy on a daily basis.
So that now it's being renegotiated. When we walk in that room, what are we looking out for our members? So there are Canadian American members or other international members. What's the biggest win that we can walk away with these negotiations?
Our hope is that the seasonality provision being introduced by the U.S. gets pulled from negotiations. I don't think that benefits anybody, not Canadians, not Americans, not Mexicans. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues that we're facing. And it's one of the biggest issues that's been identified by the Mexican government in terms of agriculture. Another thing that we want to make sure is not part of the agreement is the proposed sunset clause, where after 5 years, this agreement could be terminated or reviewed. That creates a huge level of uncertainty for business. And 5 years is not a whole lot of time. It's, I think going through this process every 5 years would be extremely difficult. And this is meant to be long-term. We've seen benefits about this for almost 24 years. It would be extremely difficult. I think it would create a huge level of uncertainty for North American businesses, not just Canadian businesses.
Negotiations would almost start as soon as they finished.
Absolutely. And, I think there are a number of issues that have been identified right now that it's probably good that we're updating things like e-commerce, which didn't exist back in the 90s. I think that's very appropriate for us to talk about. But I think there are other ways for us to look at ongoing consultations or discussions on either a bilateral or trilateral basis and trying to find those fixes through pre-established consultative groups or structures. I think that's probably the best way forward. Having a full-on review or potential termination of the agreement within 5 years, I think would be very detrimental to North American investment and competitiveness.
So it's a trade agreement, but it encompasses more than just trade. Is there any aspects of food safety or sanitary requirements that are being talked about?
As with any trade agreement, there's always going to be a chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And I think that we're seeing, especially from the US and from Mexico, and even on the Canadian side of things in the media, a lot of people are talking about, we can use a lot of the text that was agreed upon as part of the original TPP discussions. And I think for the large part, those discussions were very fruitful and created some new rules and regulations and alignment on issues that were quite beneficial for us. Maybe there's room for that to move forward even more. We'll have to wait and see what the final chapter looks like. That's going to be very standard, any trade agreement. But there's a lot of focus on that during round 6. In fact, they're going to be meeting for 4 days during round 6, which is a significant amount of time for all three parties to talk about SPS issues.
How much do we have to interact with other industries and associations that aren't necessarily produce, but they definitely have an impact on the produce industry? Products that the produce industry, it's essential for it to operate. How much interaction is there with groups like that around the table?
There's a lot of interaction like that with groups, but not necessarily to that level of granularity. The trade agreements are very high level. They provide a framework in which different countries can do commerce with one another. So for us, we want to make sure that we're aware of other issues that are being discussed, because with any trade negotiation, sometimes it's a trade-off or you have to make a concession in one area to make a gain in another. So we try to make sure that we have a full understanding of the landscape during these negotiations and what the different asks are and what the different challenges are for each industry. And that provides us a more clear picture of, what's on the table and what's being presented. So, we work a lot with our colleagues. We had a meeting and a reception with Minister Leal from Ontario, Minister Lassau from Quebec. Obviously, there are provincial goals as part of these negotiations as well, and we want to make sure that we're aware of those and tuned into those as much as possible. So we want to make sure that we have a very broad understanding of what's on the table and some of the challenges being faced across all of agriculture and even more broadly across all of Canadian business to see what this final package could look like. And just because something is happening on rules of origin doesn't mean that wouldn't have an impact on agriculture or IP or competitiveness. Everything is interlinked, and that's one of the biggest challenges with following these negotiations is making sure that you're on top of everything. But I think we've done a very good job. We've been meeting with negotiators as often as possible, and our negotiators have been fantastic in terms of providing comprehensive briefings to us and making sure that everybody knows what's going on during the negotiations.
There's a lot of pressure to get these negotiations done. I mean, you mentioned the Mexican presidential race, the American midterm elections. How much pressure is there on these negotiators, and how willing are they to actually entertain suggestions from industries?
From a Canadian standpoint, they're very interested in what industry has to say. Yes, there's, I think, perceived pressure to conclude these agreements, but I think at the end of the day, the Canadian government wants the best agreement for Canada, and they're not going to put a stop clock on these negotiations just to satisfy that. So we want to make sure that we get the best deal on SPS issues, we get the best deal in agriculture, we get the best deal in biotech. Those are hugely important chapters. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to make sure that this agreement can last for the next generation as well, and maybe even beyond that. Negotiators are taking the time that they need to get the best deal possible, and that's why, as chair of this round, Canada has put in place the longest negotiation round for NAFTA in round 6. So I think that's a good sign. We recognize that some of these things are very contentious and it's going to take longer to deal with them, but we're ready to be at the table. We're ready to be engaged. We're also ready to present creative solutions to some of the proposals being put forward. We try to make sure that our members are up to date on this as well. We have a NAFTA link on our website.
When you walked in, what was your perception about being there versus the reality?
One of the challenges has been the political rhetoric, I guess, coming out of the U.S. And I think you're seeing that, a lot of challenges between the White House and Congress. On the seasonality provision alone, Senator Flake from Arizona has put a hold on the confirmation of the U.S. Chief Agricultural Negotiator and his fears of how this provision will impact Arizona businesses. So I think that was a bit eye-opening to see that level of friction between Congress and the White House and the administration. But I think part of that is because the Canadian government and the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland and many other cabinet ministers have been so engaged on this file and going down to Washington and trying to educate the Americans on how vital this agreement is to not only to North America, but also even more specifically to the U.S. Something around 9 million jobs depend on trade and investment with Canada in the U.S. That's a huge number. 29 states have Canada as their number one trading partner. So even at the provincial and state level, Minister Leal has been very active on this front, going down to different states, Michigan and others, to try and educate those governors on how this is so important, how because of NAFTA, we've integrated supply chains across the continent. Been a success story. And I think we've kind of rested on our laurels maybe in the past. So this is an opportunity for us to say this is really beneficial for everybody. We've had such success. We are now, as a trading bloc, massive within the world. How can we modernize it and be even more competitive globally and address those issues where there are gaps, for e-commerce being one of them? But we want to make sure that the principles of do no harm, which has been a very loud and resonating statement from U.S. ag industry, we want to make sure that those principles are part of those negotiations as well. Things are working relatively well. Can we improve them? Yes, but not the detriment of any one industry or any one sector.
So is there anything else that you want to add or anything you think needs to get out there about how CPMA is contributing to these negotiations on behalf of our members?
I think, our members can be proud of the fact that we've been very engaged on this file. I think we've been working very closely with our partners like the Canadian Horticultural Council and the U.S. groups and American and Mexican groups as well. We are really working hard to make sure that this agreement benefits our industry, that we can see long-term growth as part of this, and that we keep those integrated supply chains across the continent, which have become so important for our industry over the past 24 years. So if you're interested in this file, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. While we also put a bunch of updates in our PN every month, and we update our NAFTA webpage very frequently with the latest information in terms of press releases from us or statements by us or even data around NAFTA free trade or interesting articles coming out of the U.S. that we think would be pertinent for our industry. So I think that's a great reservoir of resources for our members, and happy to talk with anybody anytime about NAFTA and hopefully the benefits of a NAFTA 2.0.
And that's it. That's all that we have for you this month on Produce Talks. I would like to thank Troy for sharing his experiences with us. As he mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to contact him, tsherman@cpma.ca. And I'd like to thank Selena for letting us know about this month's Fresh Health Award winner. Congratulations to Mike and the Execulytics team. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us by emailing podcast@cpma.ca. That's podcast@cpma.ca. Until next time, remember that it's important to continue to gain new skills, to explore and keep learning, and basically, never stop growing.
You will now be disconnected by the moderator.